How's everyone doing tonight? Christian, what's going? Hey, everyone that's on here, we are going live. Christian, am I pronouncing your name right? We're going to be going live, so we're not going to be playing a video or preaching a sermon. It's going to be more of a discussion. We have a PowerPoint slide, and we're going to be going point by point over the pandemic and the response and what that means for end time events. There are a lot of people that have been interpreting it different ways, and it's really important that we as Christians understand exactly what's happening so that we don't get deceived. So welcome, Christian and Margaret. If you guys could just let us know where you're watching us from, we'll give you a shout out, and then we'll go ahead and start. All right, let's get it going. Is the volume good? Can you guys hear us? Just type a message in the chat if you guys can hear us. Boston, Mass. All right, we got Christian from Boston, Mass. Margaret, wherever you're watching from, welcome. And let's go ahead and get started. So, all right, perfect. Thanks, Christian, for the feedback. Volume looks good. Everything's great. And all right, here we are. So the pandemic, I still remember where I was when it started. I believe it was 2020, just after February, or like towards the mid to end of February, is when everything broke out. And that pandemic has completely changed our world. From masks to social distancing and so on and so forth. And so there are many Christians around the world, and many people that feel like this was a precursor to the New World Order. This was a precursor to what's coming on the scene. And so we prayerfully have gone through and studied this biblically to see where does this line up with end time prophecy. Is this a precursor to the New World Order? Is this an antichrist move? Is this like, where does this fit into everything? And there are different preachers and different people that place it differently. And yeah, Christian, a lot of people label it as the Great Reset, right? So there's this tension, right, between the Great Reset and what's the other side? I remember that poster where it's like the Great Reset, and it's almost like the Great Revival. I know that's not the technical name that they're using. It's like I forgot what the other name is, but it's like pinned as the Great Reset versus the Great Awakening. I think that's what it's called, right?
Yes.
So it's like, so basically you have these forces, these very liberal forces that were kind of pushing this pandemic response. And now you have this Great Awakening, which is like sort of like a religious awakening. Let's take America back, right? So we're going to go through and figure out what this all means. So our starting point for this is going to be Daniel 11, and particularly the last couple of verses of Daniel 11. So throughout Daniel 11, it talks about the king of the north and the king of the south. So these are the two major powers that are warring in Daniel 11. So in Daniel 11, what we see is that at the time of the end, right, verse 40, we're going to go through these last 5 verses together and really break it down. So at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack the king of the north, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter the countries and overwhelm them and pass through them. Okay, what do we see there? We see that at the time of the end, there's this battle going on in Daniel 11, but at the time of the end, the king of the north, the king of the south will attack the king of the north, but the king of the north will overpower the king of the south, right? And so you're probably wondering, what do these powers mean? Some of you probably know what it is, some don't, but we're going to break down who is the king of the north, who is the king of the south, right? Let's keep it moving, right? So we have, he shall enter the glorious land right? The glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon, right? So let's pause there. When I was reading this, I had to really dig deep and figure out what does this mean that Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon will escape, right? And what I've discovered is that when the children of Israel were leaving Egypt, God instructed them to not attack certain people groups, right? Edom, Moab, and some other groups were not to be touched because they were the relatives of the Israelites, right? And so this signifies that there will be a group of people that the king of the north will attack that will escape, right? Everyone else is going to be destroyed, but those people will be attacked, right? Will escape. Verse 42, let's keep going. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. So he sees this news, and it emboldens him to destroy more people. Babe, stop me at all if there's any questions or anything. By the way, my name is Phil. This is my wife, Nayla. We usually have a little thing with our name at the bottom of the screen there. We'll add it for our next live stream. And he plants the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one shall help him. So he's going to come out, he's going to rage, he's going to do a bunch of stuff, and then he's going to come to his end, right? But what we see here in many different places is that he's interested in the holy land and the holy mountain and in glorious lands, right? So this is some sort of religious power, right? And somehow he overtakes this other king of the south, and then he comes to his end. So watch this. Biblically, the king of the north represents the papacy, apostate Protestantism, and counterfeit Christ when Satan comes back as Christ, right? The glorious land, you think of Jerusalem, you think of the holy mountain brings us back to, you could think of it as Mount Zion or even Mount Sinai where the Ten Commandments came from, right? He plants his tents there in between there to receive that glory, to receive that worship. He is trying to impersonate Christ, right? So we know that initially that power historically was the papacy, right? As we studied last time, right? That first beast, the papacy, suffered a deadly wound, and now in America, this next beast from the earth in Revelation 13 is apostate Protestantism. And it is apostate Protestantism that will be the one that will erect this new image to the first beast with the papacy, right? And the Bible lets us know that eventually the devil will counterfeit Christ. He will come as Christ and saying all these things as Christ, right? So the king of the north in Daniel 11 represents these powers, these pseudo-religious powers, right? The king of the south on the other end, right? Let's go back. Verse 43 says, and over all the precious things of Egypt, right? And verse 42 says, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So we see Egypt, right? So this is symbolic. What does this Egypt mean, right? And when we go to Exodus, when Moses was trying to convince Pharaoh to let his people go, Pharaoh told him in Exodus 5:2, Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. So we see that Egypt here in Daniel 11 represents a power that does not recognize God. Right? This power is like, who is this God? I'm not going to listen to you, right? So we see the opposing powers, like it's like this as this sort of like yin and yang thing, right? Where it's like the good and the bad guy, right? Where it's like the king of the north is representing God, but it's not really God, right? It's not really Christ-like, but they're standing in the place of God. The king of the south represents a power that says, I don't care about God. I don't even recognize God. And so what we know that today to be is atheism, communism, Marxism, and just overall godlessness. Any powers that say we don't care about God, that is the king of the south, right? And that's taken straight from Daniel 11 and comparing that verse upon verse to other parts of the Bible, namely Exodus. You can also the different parts in Revelation 11 that confirms who the king of the south is, right? So the key points from this, right, is that the king of the north represents any power that stands in place of God, right? Whether that's the papacy when they did it in the Dark Ages, whether it's now apostate Protestantism, which is going to set up that image to the papacy and eventually to a false Christ. And it actually represents in its fullest form Satan coming as Christ, right? Now, and the Kingdom of the South represents atheism, communism, Marxism, godlessness, any of those isms that just reject God, right? Agnosticism, everything. Any questions, any comments? What are your thoughts? Good?
Good.
Yeah, okay. So, now, the thing is, when you look at what's happening in Daniel 11, you realize that there's a back and forth, right? There's the South, King of the South is attacking King of the North, King of the North is attacking, and there's this back and forth. It's this back and forth, and it falls in line with philosophy called a Hegelian dialectic. A Hegelian dialectic. Now, some of you may be asking, what is a Hegelian dialectic?
Right.
Right? So this is what a Hegelian dialectic is. A Hegelian dialectic is this. A power has a certain agenda, right? But you know that you cannot achieve this agenda without, like, directly. If I say, hey, I want all of you guys to give me all your money now. You guys, like, transfer me all your money now. Like, no one's going to do that, right? Like, I'm not selling anything. No one's just going to hand it over, right? But now if I say that every bill has some sort of virus on it that's going to, like, infect everyone and make sure you throw it out, that may get people to throw out their money, right? And then now I can collect the money. So now I have my end goal, which is to collect all your money. And it's a goal that I couldn't achieve if I said directly, hey, give me your money, right? So with this Hegelian dialectic, the example we have here, right, is the oligarchy may have a agenda. They want to centralize power, right? But they can't just tell everyone to give them the power, right? Mm-hmm. So what they do is that they create a thesis, which is a terror event. Whether it's fake or real, it's a huge terror event that shakes up everyone in the country. Everyone in the land is scared, right? And so in order to respond to this terror event, now we have to increase the police state. Now you have to sacrifice some of your rights in order to help us battle this enemy, this terror. And the synthesis, right, is what the original goal is to remove the freedoms that you have, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of right to privacy, all that stuff. And to transfer that power over to this oligarchy, over to this power that originally just was seeking that power initially, right? So it's any systemic reasoning, exposition, or argument that juxtaposes or opposed or juxtaposes opposed or contradictory ideas and usually seeks to resolve their conflict, right? So this is what a Hegelian dialectic is. It's when a power wants to reach a certain end, but they can't do it directly, and so they have some competing war going on, right? In order to reach their end, their synthesis. Now, applying this to Daniel chapter 11, what we see is that the Bible lets us know everything that's going to happen, right? We know the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel, they're the two prophetic books of the Bible. There are a bunch of prophecies all over the Bible in Isaiah and Psalms that prophesy about Christ and other things. But when it comes to end time stuff, eschatological stuff, these two books are it, right? So now let's apply this Hegelian dialectic to Daniel 11 and see what we see, right? So we know that from the book of Revelation, from Revelation chapter 13, that this image of the beast will be made, and we will be forced to either take it on our forehead or on our hands, or we won't be able to buy or sell, and eventually there's going to be a death decree, right? So that's the goal. The goal is that Satan wants to force everyone into his worship, right? But how is he going to get everyone there, right? Like, no one could just stand up and be like, everyone, worship on this day, worship on Sunday, or take the mark of the beast. Everyone would be like, what are you talking about? Like, you can't just do that out of nowhere. You need to bring about a set of circumstances that brings the world to a place where now they want to accept this, right? So we see that the agenda is for this new world order that's worshiping Satan, that's worshiping this Antichrist, who masquerades as Jesus and who honors the false Sunday Sabbath. That is the agenda. Satan, the king of the north, wants to stand in the holy place, right? Isaiah chapter 14 talks about Satan, how he wanted to, I will stand above the stars. He wanted that worship, right? So that's always been his goal from the beginning. And so how is he going to bring that about? We see that the thesis, based on what we're talking about with the pandemic and everything that happened, right? The thesis was to allow the king of the South, right? This secular government, the Faucis and these people that are God, these people that are pushing gay marriage and pushing the trans agenda and pushing all these godless people, right? They're promoting all this lawlessness in our country, and they're promoting they're stopping us from going to church, right? This is from the King of the North's perspective, right? Stopping us from going to church, right? And so now we have the King of the North, which is these Christian nationalists in this country. They're now interpreting the pandemic restrictions as an attack on them, right? Now this is an attack on my freedom. It wasn't just that the government didn't handle things correctly and maybe they were a little bit heavy-handed. No, the King of the South, the American government right now, was targeting the churches in their point of view, right? And so because they were targeting and controlled by this power, their response is to say, we need to take over. We need to take over the nation. And this is what we saw last week with Congresswoman Boebert, who essentially was just like, what did she say? The state shouldn't direct the church.
But the church should direct the state.
Yeah. So exactly. She says we went through all these things because the state was directing the church. The state was directing the church, and we went through all this suffering. We couldn't meet. We had to wear masks. We had to social distance. This suffering, this persecution that we went through. Now it's our time to be in charge, and we're going to tell the U.S. and everyone how to behave, how to handle. Because when they're in control, they're pushing all these things on us. And the final straw is this pandemic thing, which basically is just like they're coming for our churches. They're coming for everything. They're coming for our rights, right? So this is the antithesis, which is the King of the North power, who wants to come with this Bible-based morality, this Bible-based theology, this Bible-based rule of America. Mm-hmm. To do what? To create originally what the devil wanted initially, which is just to unite church and state. It's been his goal from the very first day that America was formed to break down the wall between church and state, right? Because that's the thing that's separating us from oppression, is this barrier, right? And so this is the Hegelian dialectic that we see at play. So when you look at things happening in the world, and when you look at things happening in the States, try to map it onto the King of the North, King of the South, because that is our playbook, right, biblically, for what's happening in the world. So some of you might be wondering, well, isn't this a Protestant nation, right? How is this persecution going to come about? We know the Dark Ages, and in the Dark Ages it was the Catholics that persecuted the Protestants, right? But what we see is that it wasn't just the Catholics that were persecuting the Protestants. The Protestants also persecuted the Catholics, right? And so here's a principle that we're going to go through. We're going to go through country by country to show that this actually did happen, right? So the Catholics persecuted the Protestants, and the Protestants turned around and learned how to handle their power, right? When I'm in power, I persecute, because that's what they learned from the Catholics, and that's what they did, right? So in a sense, this persecution taught them how to wield their power. And unless God really kind of reforms you, when you go through an experience, it kind of shapes you, right? Like, you see that in family dynamics and all sorts of stuff where it's like, when I was the little guy, this is how I was treated. So now when I'm the big guy, I'm going to do the same thing.
Same thing,
right?
Yeah.
So let's go to France, right? So this is probably the most well-known massacre that happened by the Catholics against the Protestants, right? And this was in 1572. It's called St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And it was a targeted assassination by a wave of Roman Catholics against the Huguenots, or the Calvinist Protestants. And it was just crazy. Like, they say about 5,000 to 30,000 people died in total. I mean, they were going through the streets of Paris and just killing everyone, locking the city doors, and they were just going for blood, right? So we see that they tried to kill Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, right? And with murders on orders of the king of a group of Huguenot leaders, including Coligny, the massacres spread throughout Paris. It lasted several weeks. The massacre extended to other urban centers in the countryside. And they completely killed. And doing more research, I realized that the Pope at the time actually gave a golden rose to the person that kind of orchestrated this whole thing. So the papacy was elated that they killed their enemies. And this actually weakened the Protestant church like almost irreversibly in France, right? So this massive persecution that's happened during the Dark Ages by the Catholics and the Protestants. But here's what's interesting. In the Netherlands and Holland, right, we see that they have a particular history of religious conflict, which has its roots in the Calvinist Reformation of the 1560s. These conflicts became known as the Dutch Revolt or the 80 Years' War. By the dynastic inheritance, the whole of the Netherlands had come to be ruled by the kings of Spain. Even now in their national anthem, interestingly, the Dutch kind of like mention the king of Spain. So like that, it's kind of interesting how they're a sovereign nation, but they still kind of like revere the king of Spain because they were ruled by Spain for so long, right? So following aggressive Calvinist preaching in and around the rich merchant cities of the southern Netherlands, they organized anti-Catholic religious protests, which grew into violence and frequency. So what we see here is Protestants now attacking Catholics, right? So we've been persecuted for so long. Now we're in control. We're going to persecute you, right? Repression by the Catholic Spaniards in response caused Dutch Calvinists to rebel. And it sparked decades of war until the Dutch Republic won its independence from Spain, right? So, again, persecution begets persecution. Let's go on to the next place. United Kingdom. And I'm going to kind of like, not going to read all of this. I'm just going to give you the gist of it. So the Act of Supremacy of 1534 declared the English crown to be the only supreme head on earth of the church in England, right? In the place of the Pope. So any act of allegiance was towards the papacy or the Pope was considered treasonous because the papacy claimed both spiritual and political power. So it's like if you claim allegiance to the Pope, then basically you're claiming allegiance to another political power. So how can you claim to be an English man or woman and claim, you know what I mean? So it's just like that's treason.
Quick question: during those persecutions between Protestants to Catholics, there are a lot of people died too, or
a lot of
because
people
we don't hear that much about that persecution, but as much as the Catholics persecuting Protestants.
Yeah, like in number, it wasn't as much. It'll never. I mean, throughout the whole Dark Ages, I think last week we saw that it was anywhere between 50 to 150 million people were slaughtered, right? So even if it was 1 million Catholics that were killed, it just doesn't. It doesn't compare in the history books, right? So it kind of gets lost in the whole narrative, and we just focus on the Catholics persecuting the Protestants, but actually the moments in which the Protestants had that power, they persecuted too. Yeah.
Okay.
So now for this this act of uniformity made worship in the Church of England compulsory, right? So you go from being under the Catholic Church, you get power as England, go Church of England, boom, and then you have an act of uniformity in which you're trying to mandate religious belief. Like uniformly, we all have to worship in the Church of England, right? Of course, if you don't do that, there's penalties, right? And when you took a government job, you're required to take an oath of supremacy, right? And then there were penalties for violating it, included hanging and quartering. So, like, basically, you don't do this, you're dead. So the same persecution that we see the Catholics imposing on Protestants turn around and do the same thing, right? And actually, it was not only the Catholics that they persecuted, it was also the Puritans, right? The Puritans who came here on the Mayflower in 1620. They were fleeing the persecution in England, and that's why they came to the United States, right? And they were fined and physically punished and so on and so forth. Now, so we see that this persecution is happening in the United Kingdom, right? Now, but it was also happening in the United States. In the 1830s and 1840s, prominent Protestant leaders such as Lyman Beecher and Horace Bushnell attacked the Catholic Church as not only theologically unsound, but an enemy of Republican values. Now, there's some truth to that. Some scholars view the anti-Catholic rhetoric of Beecher and Bushnell as having contributed to anti-Irish and anti-Catholic mob violence. So we see there was mob violence against Catholics, right? Now, let's move down a little bit. Intolerance became more than an attitude on August 11th, 1834, in which a mob set fire to Ursuline Convent in Charleston, Massachusetts. Now they're just going around burning Catholic. Ursuline, it's a Catholic convent, right? And so we see these things happening, where there's even, this is supposed to be a nation of peace, a nation of religious freedom, and yet we're attacking Catholics who don't believe as us, right? And so some of us wonder, well, how's this persecution going to come about? And, like there's freedom of religion and the free exercise clause of the Constitution, all that stuff. Well, it's happened again. It happened before, it can happen again, right? Like this is what happened in the United States. Now, with the pandemic, we see that roughly 5,000 people, in this article, it says that roughly 5,000 people that lost their jobs in the last month due to COVID vaccine refusal made up 22% of the total number of people that were tracked being let go across the country. So when you're talking about loss, there was real loss, right? Like people really felt like their rights were being violated. And this is the dialectic, right? The Hegelian dialectic, where it's saying, man, when the secular power is wielding its power, I'm losing my job because of my freedom of conscience. Like I don't want to take this thing.
Yeah.
Right? So I can kind of see that, right? Like it's like I see that. Right? My issue is that the answer is not to mandate religious laws. Run for office and implement other laws. It wasn't a religiously based law, right? Like it wasn't like they were saying all Christians have to do this, all Christians can't do this, right? It just was what it was, right? And so I think the response now is being used as a sort of a scapegoat to push these King of the North agendas. So yeah, we acknowledge that the way the government handled it, the pandemic, caused real loss. There was real job loss. The vaccines were rushed and with questionable effects and effectiveness, right? So these are all the things that the King of the North is looking at and saying, oh, like, when the current government's in charge, it's lawlessness, right? Like we're being forced. And we know that the hurt and the pain is real, right? But ultimately, these prophecies should lead us to interpret such violations differently than mainstream Protestant America.
So what you're saying is they're going to be using what happened during the pandemic to explain why is it necessary for the church to take over.
Yeah, and we actually see voices right now saying that, like the Congresswoman is saying that, and other people have said that, and that's kind of been one of the big motivations for this Great Awakening, right? Which is, like, as Christian was saying, is like the opposite of the Great Reset, right? This Great Awakening is like, honestly,
we need to take it over.
We need to take over. This needs to become a Christian nation again, right? The issue with that is that Christ has never called us to win nations. Christ called us to win hearts. Christ has called us in the Great Commission to win people, right? And so that's vastly different than going to a country and saying, everyone must worship on the seventh day, or everyone must worship on the first day, which we now call the seventh day, or everyone must, take a break on Sabbath, and everyone must, not eat unclean meat, or whatever other laws that you want to push that are just religiously based. Listen, America is based on religious freedom. It's the free exercise clause says Congress shall make no law respecting religion, etc., etc. So if you want to worship Satan, you can do that in America. If you want to worship the trees and the rocks, if you want to worship the sun, go for it. That's America. That's the beauty of this American experiment, that you can worship as you want. I can worship as I want. You can worship as you want. And the government's not going to get involved, right? So what we're seeing now is Christians, Protestant Christians, who have completely forgot the protest. The original protest was that we don't want the government controlling what we do religiously. And now they're saying, no, we want to control what's happening religiously, right? So it's this persecution begetting persecution. And oftentimes when you have a new generation come on the scene that hasn't experienced the persecution in the past, they forget it. And that's why history is pretty cyclical, because you have new people on the scene that just read about stuff in books and they've never lived through it. And so they're like, this persecution, controlling the government seems like a good thing. Like, I didn't live through the Dark Ages, neither did any of you. So it's just kind of something we read. 50 million, like, what does that even really mean to me? Right? And that's what's kind of happening here. So like even for us, the story I wanted to tell is like we went to England, right? During the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic, right? We decided to take a trip, and it was crazy because when we were looking at the requirements, it was like we had to take a COVID vaccine, a COVID test before going there. I think we had to take a COVID test when we got there, and then we had to take a COVID test like 8 days later, which was crazy. It was just like nonstop COVID tests, right? So it was just like it was a lot. It was a lot, and so the issue I have with interpreting this again as like the King of the South implementing something directly to hinder churches or stop religious freedom is that all throughout history, human history, people have had to do things and be inconvenienced by the government, right? You look at Joseph and Mary, the whole story of Jesus, Christ our Lord, right, is based on the fact that there was a census in the land and they had to go back to the place of their birth. So Jesus was from Nazareth, but they had to travel all the way back to Bethlehem just for the census.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Jesus didn't come from a rich family. Like, they had to literally migrate over somewhere else. It's like, was that... that was very inconvenient. I'm pretty sure some people lost their jobs. I'm pretty sure no one had a say in that, right? But the issue now is that people are seeing these inconvenient government actions as religiously charged and needing a religious response. And that's where we see the master plan come into play. The King of the North really just trying to position himself to break down that wall,
Mm-hmm.
right? And honestly, what happened during the pandemic, it was inconvenient, but like, it's not persecution. Like, if you want to look at persecution, look at St. Bartholomew's Massacre. If you want to look at persecution, look at the Great Inquisition. Look at other countries in this world in which you'll literally be sent to prison or worse for just believing on something. What we went through was not persecution, and that's sort of like a key to like the over response. It's like it's an over response. Like it's a misinterpretation of what happened, right? And it's so essentially the argument goes like this: the pandemic is being used as a scapegoat, right, in order to repudiate the values of our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, right? So the argument goes like this: we refuse to have our rights violated again, right? This is Christian nationalism speaking. This is the King of the North speaking. We refuse to have our rights violated again. This is it. We're done. We're done with all this stuff. The King of the South was in power. They forced us to take vaccines, to social distance, and wear masks for no reason, not go to church. And now we have to step into power. We, the King of the North, and we're going to force our laws, right, in a way to unify the country and eventually the whole world, right? Because what's happening now, it's not unifying the world, and it's just causing turmoil and all sorts of stuff. So this is the argument that's being used, literally being used. And if you want to look at it, go on YouTube right now and look up Boebert. Look at Boebert Sunday Law. Boebert separation of church and state. All right, we have our brother. Renee. Thank you for the question, Renee. So, are you saying that religious institutions will be in charge of the government, or individuals are going to use their religious perspectives to run the government? Okay, let me see if I got that question. So, what's going to happen at the end of time is that right now, the Pope has been calling for Sunday rest for years. The Pope has been calling for a lot of stuff. No one is going to change. Atheist China is not going to all of a sudden listen to the Pope and make Sunday a day of rest. Iran, Iraq, Russia, these countries, India, Hinduism, they're not going to just follow what the Pope says, right? So we know that in the time, this religious system will only really have power when Satan appears as Christ. When these miracles are done in the name of Christ, right? So like even atheism here, they're not just going to start following the Sabbath. Atheists here, when Satan comes as Christ and he does these miracles and he comes with the dead that are raised up, quote unquote raised up, really demons, and he says, and they all are saying this thing like, this new religious law, he comes as Christ and he says, this is my law. The reason why there's so much turmoil in the earth, the reason why there's so much division and death is because you guys aren't following my Sabbath. You guys are not following what I asked you to do. And when this happens, it'll be undeniable. Unless you have a firm understanding of the Word of God, it'll be how can you deny a miracle? How can you deny fire come from heaven? How can you deny you talking with your dead grandma or grandpa again, and you're literally hearing their voice? Like, you can't deny that. It's real. You're holding them. You're touching them. The smell, the look, everything's going to be the same. And these miracles are happening such as we've never seen before. So at that point, it's going to be an overwhelming flood. So in that sense, the people in power will be following this new religious system. Because right now, on both the right and the left in our government, they're Christians, right? They're religious people. And somehow they do use the religious perspective. I know that for a lot, like for instance, Republican Party, they're against abortion, right? So most Republicans, they use their religious understanding of when life starts to say we're against abortion, right? So people are already doing that now. But it's going to be more than just religious people using their perspective. The religious institutions will essentially be running it. And it's not just all of them. It's going to be this new religion, this new Satan-led religion in which he's doing miracles. He causes fire to come down from heaven, as the Bible says. And he will be causing people to follow him and worship him and take his mark. And it'll, like Daniel 11 says, it'll be, Daniel 11 mentions how it's just completely total annihilation of the King of the South. There will be no atheists, there will be no Marxists, there will be no communists, there will be nothing but this new religion. And this small little group of people in the corner that are preaching that the seventh day is the real Sabbath and that this is the mark of the beast, and that'll enrage him. And he's just going to come after us with all sorts of fury, step by step, people losing their jobs, restrictions, so on and so forth, having to pay incentives, and then eventually a debt decree. So
basically, it's the religious perspectives that will continue to run the government. It won't be because I guess the question was, will be the religious institutions running the government, or it will be the government continue to run, but with the understanding of religion.
So I don't know particularly whether someone from like apostate Protestantism, like someone from this that's following false prophecy and like false Protestantism is going to be elected as a leader. I don't really know if that makes a difference. As long as they're listening to the church, that's the key. Like they need to be listening to this church who is being guided by the false Christ, right? So essentially, when you look at the Dark Ages, for instance, the papacy had Catholics everywhere, but they were directing every single kingdom. Like you had to listen to them. And so the kings, even though that the kings were, it was by divine right? So, my dad was a king, so now I'm the king, and my son is a king, and so on and so forth. It wasn't as if the papacy was sending people to be kings, but those kings had to listen to the papacy or else. So it could be that the presidents during that time, or the representatives or the senators, they're just normal people, but they're going to buy into this new religious system. And I imagine it might be a combination of that and maybe, people from Protestant America that might be able to get elected and so on and so forth. But the key is that they're going to be taking their orders from this new religious system.
Okay.
Good question, Renee. Any other questions? Christian, or I'm not sure if Margaret's on. Uncle Cliff, Fran, Bethy, any questions, put them in the chat and we'll answer them as best as possible. Okay, moving on. So a lot of people feel like the pandemic response was a precursor, right, to this sort of like a New World Order persecution, right? Biblically, though, that's not necessarily true, because the power that enforced these pandemic responses was not a religious power, right? If it was a religious power that was saying, if you don't worship on Sunday and if you don't work on Saturday, then hey, you have to pay a fine, or you have 30 days until you have to leave your job, then that would be a precursor to the actual like death decree, right? But this was more of a push from the King of the South, right? It was not religiously affiliated at all, right? And so in that sense, it's just part of the back and forth, right? The historical back and forth. And when you look at it, World War II, fascist Spain under Franco, China under Mao, Stalin, Soviet Union, the Rwandan genocide, all these things have been they're all steps in prophecy, right? In a general sense, in the sense that Satan enjoys corrupting humanity and experimenting on how to control people and bring about persecution, right? So all these different persecutions that have happened, it's just not only is the enemy learning how to manipulate societies, like how do you turn a whole society in the 1930s to just hate the Jewish people, right? To just now just want to kill, to just kill everyone, like the gypsies and the people that are crippled and feeble. Like, how do you turn a whole society like that? Is an experiment, and so like those lessons keep getting learned and learned and learned, and will be finally executed in its final form at the end of time. The Bible lets us know that there will be a time of trouble such as never was. So all these different things that we've learned on how to control the masses during the pandemic, during World War II, during Mao's China and Stalin's Soviet Union, in which I believe 60 million people were killed in China under Mao, and or 6 million, 6 or 60 million, but let me go with 6 just to be safe, that were killed under Mao and Stalin, right, each. So these are master classes in how to control people, how to suppress people, and that'll all be implemented in the end times. Now, if you guys don't believe what I'm saying, the former president and Donald Trump posted this on December 3rd. I believe that was 3 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
3 days ago, President Trump said, "So, with the revelation of massive and widespread fraud, this is a call to suspend the Constitution and terminate all the rules." Crazy stuff, right? So, with the revelation of massive and widespread fraud and deception, and working closely with big tech companies, the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, and the Democratic Party, do you throw the presidential election results of 2020 out and declare the rightful winner? Or do you have a new election? A massive fraud of this type and magnitude allows for the termination of all rules. Trump wants to terminate all rules, including regulations, articles, even those found in the Constitution. This is crazy. Like, absolutely crazy. Our great founders did not want and would not condone false and fraudulent elections. So, it's not just me saying it. If you look at what's happening in the world, Boebert is calling for the separation of church and state to fall down. Trump, who is now officially announced that he's running for president again. So this may be our future president. He is calling for the Constitution, the rules of the Constitution, to be completely obliterated. And that's our only safeguard. The Constitution, Bill of Rights ensure freedom of speech, freedom of press, right to bear arms, right? Free exercise of religion. All of that is in the Constitution. So this would be unfathomable 100 years ago. Let me just put it that way. In 1922, anyone that came out and said this would literally just be erased politically. Like, talk about like being canceled. You are going to be canceled in 1922 if you say this. In 1940, you're going to be canceled. 1990, you're going to be canceled. In 2000, you would be canceled. Now this stuff is being said openly, right? And so this is the movement that we're seeing, right? And so Benjamin Franklin said something that's incredibly powerful, right? That I want us to leave with to close out this session, right? Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. In essence, never eradicate, never terminate the rules of the Constitution, ever. Like, never give up your right to privacy, ever. Never give up the right to freedom of press, ever, no matter what people are saying, right? Because ultimately, you don't deserve either, because you don't understand how much the United States fought, how much people have fought and died for that freedom and liberty. It's incredible. Like, this is, I think that Benjamin Franklin was a deist, but ultimately, you know, what he says here is spot on. Like, these things are happening, right? These things are being like these dog whistles are being used to say, oh, this is crazy, we're under control, we're under persecution, we're under attack, oh, the secular government, so that we would give up our liberty, so that we could restore a president who thinks that he was falsely denied, you know, the White House again. All these things are being used as excuses to tear down the wall. And that wall separation being torn down is the goal of the King of the North. He wants to tear that down. And eventually it will be torn down, right? But it's our job to speak the truth and speak the truth in love and say that, listen, this thing should not be torn down. This is what makes America great. What makes America great is the Constitution. What makes America great is the Declaration of Independence. That says all men are created equal. You're equal to me. I'm equal to you. Everyone's equal. We all have a vote. This government is of the people, right? And so we should never allow these walls to be torn down, no matter what happens, right? And so, in conclusion, our goal with this channel is that knowing the future means knowing deception. Basically, if you know the future, you can say no to deception, right? And the Bible lets us know what the future is. The Bible lets us know that there is a truth. There is a truth. Like, and Jesus gives us that truth in his word, right? And if we follow him and we follow what he tells us to do and what he tells us is coming, we won't be sidetracked by all these false prophecies, right? So, in conclusion, the pandemic we see was a response. The pandemic response was led out by a king of the South power, which infuriated the king of the North, right? So the king of the South let out, and now there's this call for Christian nationalism, right? That's on the rise, right? This added fuel and a pretense to the king of the North to push for the church to direct the state. Let's break down that wall, and that's what we see happening now in our country, right? And the future is yet to be seen. But in future talks, we are going to dissect other aspects of prophecy and certain things. But for this topic, if there are any questions before we close out, please put them in the chat, and we will be sure to answer them. We'll give you like another minute or so. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, we're going to close out this meeting. Feel free to message me if you have any other topics or any questions that you have concerning prophecy, what's happening in this country, in America, and the role that America will play in these final events, because the name of this ministry is American Prophecies. And based on Revelation 13, we know that America is that final beast that will be pushing this Sunday law, will be pushing this beast worship, right? And so it's being that we are in America, it's important for us to know what that all means. So thank you once again for joining, and we will
Please spread the word. Let your friends and family members to know about our ministry. We want to be able to share our understandings and findings with everyone else. And we'll be here again next week, Tuesday.
Next week, Tuesday.
At 7 p.m. Central Time.
Yep. Sounds good. So stay blessed, everyone, and we will see you next week.
I was thinking.